The crystal spires of Draconia Prime gleamed under three suns, their light casting rainbow patterns across the imperial palace walls. Deep within the palace's eastern wing, a small dragon huddled in the corner of what should have been a magnificent nursery. Prince Ember pressed himself against the cool stone wall, watching dust motes dance in the colored light streaming through stained glass windows that depicted the glorious deeds of his ancestors. At 3 months old, Ember should have been soaring between those very spires, his wings cutting through the thin atmosphere with natural grace. Instead, his wings hung limp at his sides, the delicate membranes between his wing bones seeming fragile as old parchment. When he tried to flap them, they barely stirred the air around him. The young prince's golden scales caught the light beautifully, and his bright green eyes showed intelligence far beyond his age. But in a culture where flight meant freedom and fire meant power, these qualities counted for nothing. Every day, palace servants whispered when they thought he couldn't hear them. Every day, his older brothers returned from their aerial training sessions, chattering excitedly about their progress while Ember remained silent. Emperor Malthorn the Crimson ruled the Draconian Empire with wisdom earned through centuries of life. His massive form, covered in deep red scales that seemed to hold inner fire, commanded respect from dragons across 12 star systems. When he walked through the palace corridors, lesser dragons bowed so low their snouts touched the floor. His roar could shake mountains, and his flame could turn sand to glass in seconds. But when he entered his youngest son's nursery each evening, the mighty emperor became simply a worried father. He would lower his great head to nuzzle Ember gently, careful not to let his natural heat harm the delicate hatchling. Sometimes he would tell stories of distant worlds, of brave dragons who protected their territories and brought honor to their clans. Ember listened eagerly, his eyes shining with wonder. But both father and son knew the truth that hung unspoken between them. The Imperial Council grew more restless with each passing day. These ancient dragons, some nearly as old as the Emperor himself, gathered in the shadow chamber to discuss matters of state. Their voices echoed through stone corridors as they debated trade agreements, military strategies, and territorial disputes. But lately, their conversations turned more and more frequently to the matter of the defective prince. Councillor Vorthak, whose black scales had earned him the nickname, the Dark Wing, spoke loudest against keeping Ember in the line of succession. His arguments followed traditional dragon law and customs that had governed their society for millennia. A dragon who could not fly was not truly dragon, he claimed. A prince who could not breathe fire could never inspire the respect necessary to rule. Other council members voiced similar concerns, though some spoke more gently. They suggested special schools for dragons with disabilities, or perhaps a quiet life in the outer provinces where Ember's limitations would not be noticed. All of their suggestions, no matter how kindly meant, amounted to the same thing: exile from the royal family and abandonment of any claim to the throne. The Emperor listened to these debates with growing frustration. He had consulted the finest dragon physicians in the Empire, specialists who understood every aspect of draconic anatomy and development. They examined Ember's wings with delicate instruments, measured his lung capacity, tested his flame glands with gentle stimulation. Each examination produced the same disappointing results. Dr. Flameheart, the oldest and most respected physician in the Empire, delivered his final diagnosis with obvious reluctance. Ember's wing membranes were indeed too thin to support proper flight. His fire glands showed unusual development patterns that might never produce proper flames. The cause remained mysterious, but the condition appeared permanent. The palace became a place of tension and hushed conversations. Servants who had once cooed over the adorable prince now avoided his nursery. Ember's tutors struggled to maintain their enthusiasm for lessons when they doubted their student would ever have a meaningful future. Even his brothers, though they loved him, seemed embarrassed by his presence during formal court functions. Ember felt this change in atmosphere, with the keen sensitivity that children possess. He stopped trying to fly when others were watching, tired of seeing disappointment replace hope in their eyes. He stopped attempting to produce fire during lessons, knowing that his pathetic wisps of smoke only made everyone feel sorry for him. Instead, he spent more time alone, reading the ancient histories and star charts that filled the palace library. The books told stories of dragon heroes who conquered worlds and built the great empire that Ember was supposed to inherit someday. They described battles fought with claw and flame, diplomatic victories won through shows of draconic strength, and the proud traditions that made dragons the most respected species in their corner of the galaxy. Each story reminded Ember of everything he could never be. One particularly difficult evening, after a day of failed flight training that left his wing muscles aching and his confidence shattered, Ember overheard a conversation that changed everything. The Emperor was meeting with his closest advisors in the small chamber next to the nursery. The stone walls carried sound better than anyone realized. His father's voice, heavy with defeat, spoke words that pierced Ember's heart. The traditional methods were not working. The council was losing patience. Unless something changed soon, they would be forced to make the devastating decision to remove Ember from the royal succession and send him away from the only home he had ever known. But then the Emperor said something that filled Ember with a mixture of hope and terror. There was one option they had not tried. One group of beings in the galaxy who possessed an almost magical ability to help the children of other species. They were called humans, and they came from a small blue world that most dragons considered insignificant. These humans had developed techniques for nurturing young that defied explanation. They had helped crystalline children learn to sing when their natural resonance chambers were damaged. They had taught young tentacle beasts to swim when birth defects left them unable to control their propulsion systems. Most remarkably, they had guided several species' children through developmental problems that their own experts had declared hopeless. The idea of hiring an alien nanny went against every tradition of draconic child-rearing. Dragons raised their own young, teaching them the ancient ways that had served their people for thousands of years. The very suggestion that an outsider, especially a mammal, could succeed where dragon wisdom had failed seemed absurd. But Emperor Malthorn was a desperate father before he was a traditional ruler. If there was even the smallest chance that a human could help his son, he was willing to risk the disapproval of his council and the gossip of his court. The decision was made. Though the Emperor knew it might be his last chance to save both his son and his dynasty, Anna Reed had never imagined her career would lead her to the throne room of the most powerful dragon in the galaxy. The transport ship from Earth Colony Station 7 had taken 3 weeks to reach Draconia Prime, giving her plenty of time to study everything known about dragon physiology and child development. The files were surprisingly thin, since dragons rarely allowed outsiders to study their young. She stood now in the receiving chamber, trying not to feel intimidated by the massive space carved from solid crystal. The ceiling stretched so high above her head that clouds could have formed up there. Intricate carvings covered every surface, depicting dragon legends in stunning detail. The artwork was beautiful, but it also served as a reminder of the immense expectations placed on every dragon child born into this culture. Emperor Malthorn entered through doors that seemed designed for giants. Anna had seen recordings of dragons before, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing before such a magnificent creature. His scales reflected the light like polished rubies, and his eyes held the wisdom of centuries. When he spoke, his voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. The Emperor's manner was formal but not unkind. He explained the situation with brutal honesty that Anna appreciated. His son was failing to develop the basic abilities that define dragons as a species. The finest experts in the Empire had tried every traditional method without success. Time was running out before the council would force a decision that neither father nor son wanted to face. Anna listened carefully, taking notes on her small electronic pad. She asked questions about Ember's daily routine, his diet, his emotional state, and his relationships with family members. Some of her inquiries seemed to puzzle the Emperor, particularly her questions about the young prince's feelings and fears. Dragons, she learned, typically focused on physical development rather than emotional well-being. The terms of her employment were clear and somewhat frightening. She would have 1 standard year to help Prince Ember develop his flight and fire-breathing abilities. If she succeeded, she would be rewarded beyond her wildest dreams and would have the eternal gratitude of the imperial family. If she failed, both she and Ember would be exiled from Draconia Prime. though the Emperor promised to ensure their safety in whatever distant world they chose for their new home. Anna accepted the challenge without hesitation, though her heart raced with nervousness. She had worked with difficult cases before, but never under such pressure or with such severe consequences for failure. As she followed a palace guide through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, she reviewed everything. She knew about working with traumatized or struggling children. The nursery took her breath away. The room was huge by human standards, with a ceiling that soared 30 feet above the floor. Expensive toys and training equipment filled the space, including miniature flying courses and flame practice targets. Everything was beautifully made, and obviously expensive, but the room felt cold and impersonal despite its grandeur. Prince Ember hid behind a massive bookshelf when Anna entered. She caught only a glimpse of golden scales and bright green eyes before he disappeared completely from view. Her guide, a stern-looking dragon servant, gestured toward the hiding spot and shook his head with obvious disapproval. This was the prince, he seemed to say, though he behaved more like a frightened animal than royalty. Anna dismissed the guide politely and sat down on the floor, making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. She had learned long ago that rushing toward a scared child, especially one from a different species, usually made the situation worse. Instead, she began to talk in a quiet, gentle voice about neutral topics. She described her journey to Draconia, Prime, the beauty of the Crystal Palace, and some of the interesting things she had seen in the other star systems she had visited. Gradually, she noticed small sounds from behind the bookshelf. Ember was listening, even though he remained hidden. Anna continued talking, sharing stories about Earth and the many different creatures that lived there. She described how Earth children learned to walk and run at different ages, and how some took longer than others to develop their abilities. After nearly an hour, Ember's curiosity finally overcame his fear. A small golden head peeked around the edge of the bookshelf, followed by worried green eyes that studied Anna carefully. He was smaller than she had expected, about the size of a large house cat, with delicate features and an intelligent expression that reminded her of human children she had worked with. Anna smiled warmly, but didn't move toward him. Instead, she continued her stories, occasionally asking gentle questions that Ember could answer with simple nods or head shakes. Did he like books? Yes. Did he enjoy flying practice? A definite no. Did he feel sad sometimes? The tiny dragon's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly. The breakthrough came when Anna asked if Ember would like to hear a story from Earth about a young eagle who was afraid to fly. The little dragon emerged fully from his hiding place, settling down a safe distance away but clearly interested. Anna told the story of how the eagle's mother didn't force him to fly, but instead helped him build confidence by teaching him to glide from lower and lower branches until flying became natural. Ember listened with complete attention, his eyes growing wider as the story progressed. When Anna finished, he spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked if the eagle was really able to fly after being so afraid. Anna assured him that the eagle became one of the strongest flyers in the forest, precisely because he had learned slowly and carefully instead of being rushed. The rest of that first day passed quietly. Anna observed Ember's behavior, noting how he moved, what interested him, and how he reacted to different situations. She watched him attempt to flap his wings during his scheduled exercise time, seeing how frustration and embarrassment overwhelmed him when the wings barely moved. She noticed how he tried to produce fire during his breathing lessons, only to cough up tiny wisps of smoke that made him hang his head in shame. But Anna also saw things that others seemed to miss. Ember was incredibly intelligent, reading books meant for dragons twice his age. He was creative, building elaborate structures from his toys when he thought no one was watching. Most importantly, he was kind and gentle, showing concern for a injured palace bird that had fallen into his room through an open window. The palace staff treated Anna with polite suspicion. They provided her with comfortable quarters and answered her questions about dragon care, but she could feel their doubt. Many seemed to think she was wasting everyone's time with methods that seemed too soft for dragon children. Some were more openly skeptical, wondering how a mammal could possibly understand the needs of a reptilian species. Anna ignored the criticism and focused on her patient. Each day, she spent hours with Ember, slowly building his trust and confidence. Instead of forcing him through painful exercises, she created games that strengthened his wings naturally. Rather than demanding fire-breathing performances, she taught him breathing techniques that relaxed his throat muscles and reduced his anxiety. The changes were small at first, barely noticeable to anyone except Anna and Ember himself. The little dragon began to sleep better at night. He started eating more regularly instead of picking at his food. Most significantly, he began to smile occasionally, something palace servants claimed they had never seen before. Word of Anna's unusual methods spread through the palace staff. Some dragons muttered about the softness of human child-rearing techniques. Others wondered if the strange alien woman was making their prince even weaker by coddling him. But Emperor Malthorn, watching his son's gradual transformation from a frightened, miserable creature into a curious, hopeful child, decided to give Anna all the time and support she needed. 3 months had passed since Anna's arrival, and the palace buzzed with quiet controversy about her methods. The human woman had completely ignored every piece of traditional dragon child-rearing wisdom, replacing strict training schedules with what many courtiers called playing games. Instead of forcing Prince Ember through grueling flight drills, she spent hours helping him build confidence through activities that seemed more like fun than education. Anna's daily routine with Ember bore no resemblance to the rigorous programs used for other dragon children. Each morning, instead of beginning with mandatory wing exercises, they started with storytelling. Anna would sit cross-legged on the nursery floor while Ember curled up nearby, listening with rapt attention to tales from distant worlds. These weren't just entertainment, though the young prince didn't realize it. Anna carefully chose stories about characters who overcame their fears, who found strength in their differences, and who discovered that courage came in many forms. The first major breakthrough came during what Anna called gliding practice. Traditional dragon training involved dropping young dragons from increasingly high platforms until they learned to fly through necessity. Anna took the opposite approach. She started with something so simple it seemed ridiculous to palace observers, helping Ember slide down a gentle ramp on his belly, arms stretched wide to feel how air moved over his wing membranes. Ember loved this game, giggling as he whooshed down the small slide Anna had built from cushions and boards. He didn't realize he was learning how air resistance worked, or how slight changes in wing position could affect his movement. Anna gradually made the slide steeper and longer, always keeping the experience fun and safe. Soon, Ember was spreading, his wings instinctively during his slides, feeling the lift that gentle air currents provided. The palace staff watched these activities with bewildered expressions. Elder dragons who had trained dozens of young ones over the centuries shook their massive heads in confusion. This human was teaching their prince to play in the dirt instead of soaring through the sky like his ancestors. Some muttered that Emperor Malthorn had made a terrible mistake hiring such an unconventional teacher. But Anna understood something about child development that dragon culture had forgotten in its focus on tradition and strength. Fear was the greatest barrier to learning, especially for a child who had experienced repeated failure. Every time Ember had been forced to attempt flight before he was ready, every time he had been scolded for producing weak flames, his confidence had crumbled further. Anna's first job was to rebuild that confidence from the ground up. Fire-breathing training followed a similar philosophy. Instead of demanding that Ember produce roaring flames like his brothers, Anna started with something much simpler. She taught him breathing exercises that helped him relax, showing him how to control the flow of air through his lungs. They practiced warming cups of milk with gentle breaths, celebrating each tiny improvement as a victory worth praising. Ember began to flourish under this approach. His eyes, which had been dull with resignation when Anna first arrived, now sparkled with curiosity and hope. He started asking questions about everything around him, from the mechanics of dragon flight to the customs of Anna's homeworld. His natural intelligence, previously hidden under layers of fear and shame, began to shine through. The young prince's relationship with food improved dramatically once Anna removed the stress from mealtimes. Dragon children typically ate in formal dining halls, monitored by tutors who corrected their posture and table manners. Anna arranged for private meals in the garden, where Ember could eat at his own pace while they talked about interesting topics. His appetite returned, and with it came the physical energy he needed for more active play. Anna introduced concepts that were revolutionary in dragon culture. She taught Ember that making mistakes was a normal part of learning, not a source of shame. She showed him that different individuals developed skills at different rates and that slower development didn't mean permanent failure. Most importantly, she demonstrated that his worth as a person wasn't tied to his ability to meet arbitrary standards set by others. These lessons extended beyond flight and fire breathing into every aspect of Ember's education. When he struggled with mathematics, Anna found ways to make numbers interesting instead of demanding perfect performance. When he had trouble with historical dates, she turned memorization into storytelling games. Learning became something enjoyable, rather than another opportunity for failure. The turning point came during what Anna privately called the Great Wing Discovery. She had been working with Ember on gradually increasing his gliding distances, using a series of small platforms she had built in the garden. Ember had progressed from belly sliding down ramps to actually gliding short distances with his wings spread for balance. On this particular afternoon, Ember was practicing his longest glide yet, from a platform about 6 feet high to a soft landing area 10 feet away. Anna stood at the landing spot, arms outstretched encouragingly, ready to catch him if needed. Ember spread his wings, took a deep breath, and pushed off from the platform with more confidence than ever before. Something magical happened in that moment. Instead of the controlled fall that Anna expected, Ember's wings actually caught air properly for the first time in his young life. He soared past the landing area, his eyes wide with amazement, wings beating instinctively as he discovered the joy of true flight. He managed to stay airborne for nearly 20 feet before landing gracefully on the grass, his whole body trembling with excitement. Anna rushed over to find Ember staring at his wings in wonder, as if seeing them for the first time. He looked up at her with tears of joy streaming down his golden scales and whispered the words that made all her patient work worthwhile. "I flew, Anna. I really flew." Word of this achievement spread through the palace like wildfire. Servants, who had dismissed Anna's methods, suddenly found reasons to walk past the garden during training sessions. Emperor Malthorn himself began making regular visits to observe his son's progress, his ancient heart swelling with pride as he watched Ember's confidence bloom. But not everyone celebrated these developments. The old dragons of the Imperial Council grew increasingly uncomfortable with the changes they observed in Prince Ember. Yes, he was learning to fly, but he was also developing ideas and attitudes that seemed foreign to traditional dragon culture. He asked questions about other species, showed interest in diplomatic solutions rather than shows of strength, and worst of all, displayed the kind of empathy and compassion that they considered weaknesses in a future ruler. Councillor Vorthak voiced the concerns of the traditionalists during a private meeting with the emperor. The human woman was indeed helping the prince develop his physical abilities, but at what cost to his dragon identity? Ember was becoming soft, too interested in the feelings and perspectives of others, too willing to consider alternatives to the aggressive leadership style that had built their empire. Emperor Malthorn listened to these concerns with a heavy heart. He could see the changes in his son, and while most of them filled him with joy, he also worried about how Ember would be received by a culture that valued strength above kindness. A ruler who showed too much compassion might be seen as weak, potentially inviting challenges from ambitious nobles or enemy empires. These political pressures created tension that Ember was beginning to sense, even though the adults tried to shield him from the controversy. He noticed that some palace staff treated Anna differently now, with a mixture of grudging respect and lingering disapproval. He overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he appeared. Most troubling of all, he could feel the weight of expectations growing heavier as his abilities improved. Anna recognized these signs and knew that her greatest challenge was yet to come. Teaching Ember to fly and breathe fire was relatively simple compared to preparing him to navigate the complex political and cultural pressures of dragon society. She needed to help him develop confidence in his abilities while also teaching him to stay true to the kind, curious nature that made him special. The deadline for formal testing was approaching rapidly, and with it would come the ultimate proof of whether Anna's methods could truly succeed in preparing a dragon prince for his destiny. 6 months had passed since Prince Ember's first successful flight, and the entire palace knew that Judgment Day was approaching. The Imperial Council had officially scheduled the formal testing ceremony for the following week, giving Anna and her young student only 7 more days to prepare for what would determine both of their futures. The grand throne room had been cleared and prepared, with ceremonial braziers positioned at precise intervals and ancient measuring devices installed to record every detail of Ember's performance. Anna spent sleepless nights reviewing everything she knew about dragon testing traditions. The ceremony itself was ancient, dating back thousands of years to when the first dragon emperors established the requirements for royal succession. A young dragon must demonstrate 3 specific abilities: sustained flight across the full length of the throne room, precise control during aerial maneuvers, and the ignition of the sacred flame brazier using their natural fire breath. Failure in any category meant immediate disqualification from the royal line. The pressure was enormous, but Anna worried most about how it was affecting Ember's emotional state. The young prince had made remarkable progress over the past months, growing from a terrified hatchling into a confident young dragon who could fly gracefully around the palace gardens and produce steady flames when relaxed. But Anna knew that performing under the scrutiny of hundreds of critical observers would be completely different from practicing in the safety of their private training sessions. Ember's brothers had all passed their formal tests with flying colors, literally soaring through their ceremonies with the natural grace that made dragons the envy of other flying species. The court still whispered stories of Prince Flame's spectacular display 3 years earlier, when he had not only lit the ceremonial brazier but melted it completely, requiring the palace smiths to forge a replacement from stronger materials. These stories, meant to inspire, only added to the weight of expectations pressing down on Ember's shoulders. 3 days before the ceremony, Ember experienced what Anna privately called a confidence crisis. During their morning practice session, he attempted a simple gliding exercise he had mastered weeks earlier, only to crash awkwardly into a rosebush when his concentration wavered. The physical scrapes healed quickly, but the emotional damage cut much deeper. Ember spent the rest of that day hiding in his favorite corner of the library, refusing to speak to anyone or attempt any further training. Anna found him there that evening, curled up behind a massive tome of ancient dragon law with tears streaking down his golden scales. She sat quietly nearby, not pushing him to talk, simply offering her presence as comfort. Eventually, Ember's story poured out in broken whispers. He was terrified of failing in front of the entire court, of proving that all the whispered doubts about his abilities were correct, of disappointing his father and shaming his family name forever. The conversation that followed became one of the most important in both of their lives. Anna shared stories from her own childhood on Earth, describing times when she had been afraid to perform in front of others, and how those fears had nearly prevented her from pursuing the career that eventually brought her to Draconia Prime. She explained that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to try despite being afraid. More importantly, Anna helped Ember understand that his worth as a dragon and as a person wasn't determined by a single performance, no matter how important it seemed to others. She reminded him of all the progress he had made, not just in flying and fire-breathing, but in becoming a kinder, more thoughtful individual who cared about others and asked questions about the world around him. These qualities, she insisted, were just as valuable as physical abilities. The night before the ceremony, Anna made a decision that shocked the palace staff. Instead of conducting a final intensive practice session, she took Ember on a quiet walk through the royal gardens, under the light of Draconia Prime's 3 moons. They talked about everything except the upcoming test, discussing the flowers blooming in the moonlight, the patterns of stars visible above them, and Ember's dreams for his future beyond the pressures of royal succession. This peaceful evening seemed to restore some of Ember's confidence, but Anna could still sense his nervousness the next morning as servants arrived to prepare him for the ceremony. The traditional pre-test rituals involved elaborate grooming, the application of ceremonial oils that enhanced scale shine, and the careful polishing of claws and wing membranes. Ember submitted to these preparations with quiet dignity, but Anna noticed how his hands trembled slightly during the process. The throne room filled early with spectators eager to witness what many expected to be either a miraculous triumph or a spectacular failure. Members of the Imperial Council took their seats in the front rows, their ancient faces showing mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. Emperor Malthorn sat upon his crystal throne, his expression carefully neutral, though Anna could see the love and worry in his ancient eyes. Anna was permitted to stand in a small alcove near the entrance, close enough to offer Ember moral support, but far enough away to avoid any accusations of interference during the actual testing. She watched as her young student entered the throne room, his golden scales gleaming under the ceremonial lights, his wings held with dignity despite their relatively small size compared to those of his brothers. The testing protocol began with flight demonstrations. Ember positioned himself at one end of the massive throne room, a space so large that successful flight across its length required not just ability, but considerable stamina. The watching dragons fell silent, hundreds of eyes focusing on the small figure who represented either the future of their dynasty or its greatest embarrassment. Ember spread his wings and Anna held her breath. For a moment the young prince stood perfectly still, and she worried that his nerves might overwhelm him completely. But then he looked across the room toward the alcove where she stood, and their eyes met briefly. Anna smiled and nodded encouragingly, mouthing the words they had practiced together, "You can do this." With a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from every lesson they had shared, Ember launched himself into the air. His takeoff wasn't the explosive burst of power that his brothers had demonstrated, but it was smooth and controlled, showing the careful technique Anna had taught him. He rose to the proper ceremonial height and began his journey across the throne room. The flight wasn't perfect by traditional dragon standards, but it was beautiful in its own way. Ember's wing beats were steady and rhythmic, lacking the raw power of older dragons but showing precision and grace that came from months of patient practice. He navigated the required aerial patterns with careful attention to form, demonstrating that while he might not be the strongest flyer in dragon history, he was certainly competent and improving with every beat of his wings. The real test came with the fire-breathing demonstration. The sacred flame brazier stood at the far end of the throne room, its metal surface polished to mirror brightness for the ceremony. Ember landed gracefully nearby, his breathing slightly elevated from the flight but his posture confident. This was the moment that would determine everything, the ability that most clearly defined dragons as a species. Anna watched from her alcove, her heart pounding as Ember positioned himself before the brazier. She could see him taking the deep, calming breath she had taught him, centering himself the way they had practiced hundreds of times in the garden. The throne room was so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Ember drew in one final breath, deeper than any he had ever taken, and released a stream of flame that was steady, controlled, and perfectly adequate to light the ceremonial wood. The fire wasn't the roaring inferno that his brothers had produced, but it was real dragon fire, sustained for the required duration and hot enough to fulfill the ancient requirements of the ceremony. The sacred flame caught and blazed to life, its light reflecting off the crystal walls and casting dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled dragons. For a moment, the throne room remained silent, as if everyone was still processing what they had witnessed. Then Emperor Malthorn rose from his throne, his massive form radiating pride and joy as he began the traditional declaration that would officially recognize his youngest son as a true dragon and rightful heir to the imperial throne. The celebration that followed Prince Ember's successful testing lasted for 3 days throughout the Crystal Palace and beyond into the capital city. Dragons who had whispered doubts about the young prince now spoke loudly of his courage and determination. The story of his triumph spread quickly through the communication networks that connected the 12 star systems of the Draconian Empire, inspiring parents whose own children struggled with traditional development expectations. Anna found herself transformed overnight, from a controversial outsider into something approaching a celebrity. Dragons who had barely acknowledged her presence for months now sought her advice about their own children's education. The palace mailroom delivered hundreds of messages from families across the empire, all asking whether human teaching methods might help their struggling young ones. But the most significant changes were happening within Prince Ember himself. The shy, fearful hatchling had grown into a confident young dragon who carried himself with quiet dignity. His success in the formal testing had proven to everyone, including himself, that he belonged in the royal family. Yet the months of working with Anna had also given him perspectives that set him apart from traditional dragon thinking. Ember began asking questions that made the Imperial Council uncomfortable. During his first formal policy briefing after the ceremony, he inquired about trade relationships with species that dragons typically considered inferior. He wondered aloud whether diplomatic solutions might be more effective than military threats in certain territorial disputes. Most surprisingly, he expressed genuine interest in learning about the cultures and customs of non-dragon civilizations. These attitudes reflected everything Anna had taught him about looking beyond surface differences to find common ground with others. While the Imperial Council had worried that human influence would make Ember weak, the opposite had proven true. His willingness to consider multiple perspectives actually made him a more thoughtful and potentially effective leader than dragons, who relied solely on traditional approaches. Emperor Malthorn watched his son's development with mixed emotions. He was proud of Ember's growth and grateful for the confidence the young prince had gained. But he also recognized that his son's ideas would face resistance from conservative elements within dragon society. The emperor began planning how to gradually introduce these new concepts to his people without causing social upheaval. The first major test of Ember's new approach came 6 months after his ceremony, when a minor trade dispute arose with the Felinoid Republic, a confederation of cat-like species from the Outer Rim systems. Traditional dragon diplomacy would have involved a show of military force, designed to intimidate the Felinoids into accepting dragon terms. Instead, Ember suggested that his father send a cultural exchange delegation to better understand Felinoid concerns and find mutually beneficial solutions. The Imperial Council initially rejected this proposal as showing weakness, but Emperor Malthorn decided to give his son's approach a chance. The cultural exchange proved remarkably successful, leading not only to resolution of the trade dispute but also to new agreements that benefited both civilizations. Word of this diplomatic victory spread throughout the galaxy, establishing the Draconian Empire's reputation as a more sophisticated and approachable power than many had previously believed. Anna watched these developments with pride, but she also faced a difficult personal decision. The original terms of her employment had been fulfilled beyond anyone's expectations. Ember no longer needed intensive daily support, and the techniques she had developed were being studied and adapted by dragon educators throughout the Empire. The question now was whether she should remain on Draconia Prime as a permanent advisor, or return to Earth to share her experiences with other human specialists. The choice became more complicated when Ember approached her with a proposal that surprised everyone. The young prince had been studying reports from various parts of the galaxy about children from different species who faced developmental challenges similar to what he had experienced. He wanted to establish an interspecies program that would provide help and support to struggling young ones regardless of their biological origins. Ember's vision was ambitious and unprecedented. He imagined a mobile facility, staffed by specialists from multiple species that could travel between star systems, providing assistance to families who had nowhere else to turn. The program would combine the best techniques from each civilization's child-rearing traditions, creating new approaches that honored different cultural values while focusing on individual children's needs. Anna was deeply moved by this proposal, seeing in it the culmination of everything she had tried to teach Ember about compassion and looking beyond traditional boundaries. But she also recognized the enormous challenges such a program would face. Many species were suspicious of outside interference in their family structures, and funding such an ambitious project would require support from multiple governments. Emperor Malthorn surprised everyone by endorsing his son's vision enthusiastically. The Emperor had come to understand that his empire's long-term prosperity depended on maintaining positive relationships with other civilizations, and Ember's program could serve as a powerful tool for building goodwill throughout the galaxy. More personally, He was proud to see his son channeling his own difficult experiences into a desire to help others. The Imperial Council's approval came more reluctantly, but they could hardly argue against a program that would enhance the Empire's diplomatic influence while showcasing dragon generosity and wisdom. The project was officially approved and funded, with construction beginning immediately on a specialized starship designed to serve as a mobile learning and treatment center. Anna accepted the position as the program's first director, but she also insisted on training dragon specialists who could eventually take over leadership roles. She had learned from her experience with Ember that the most effective help came from understanding and respecting each species' unique characteristics rather than imposing outside solutions. The starship that would serve as their mobile headquarters was a marvel of engineering, equipped with facilities designed to accommodate the needs of dozens of different species. Living quarters could be adjusted for various atmospheric requirements, gravity preferences, and social customs. The educational areas included spaces for physical training, psychological counseling, and cultural activities that helped young ones from different worlds feel comfortable and accepted. Prince Ember, now approaching his second birthday and considered a young adult by dragon standards, insisted on participating in the program's first mission rather than simply serving as its royal patron. His own experiences had given him insights that no amount of academic study could provide, and his presence helped reassure families that their children would be understood and respected rather than judged. Their first assignment took them to a mining colony where several crystalline children had lost their natural resonance abilities after exposure to industrial pollutants. Anna and Ember worked together with local specialists to develop new techniques that helped the young crystallines regain their voices through alternative methods. The success of this mission established the program's reputation and led to requests for assistance from dozens of other worlds. As their ship traveled between star systems, Anna often found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. She had come to Draconia Prime expecting to help one struggling child, but that experience had evolved into something that would benefit thousands of young ones across the galaxy. More importantly, it had demonstrated that differences between species could be sources of strength rather than barriers to cooperation. Ember had grown into exactly the kind of leader Anna had hoped he would become. He was strong when strength was needed, but also compassionate, curious, and willing to learn from others. His reign, when it eventually came, would likely transform the Draconian Empire from a military power into a force for positive change. Throughout their corner of the galaxy, the program continued to expand, with new specialists from various species joining their team and additional ships being constructed to serve more distant regions. Anna remained director for several more years before finally returning to Earth to establish a training academy that would prepare the next generation of interspecies child development specialists. But her connection with Ember and the Dragon royal family remained strong throughout her life. She received regular reports about the prince's continued growth as a leader and the ongoing success of the program they had created together. The shy, frightened hatchling she had first met hiding behind a bookshelf had become a symbol of hope for struggling families across the galaxy, proof that every child deserved the chance to discover their own unique strengths and abilities.